Well, earlier I spoke with Marc Dones, Executive Director of the non-profit National Innovation Service, about ways we might deal with the affordable housing crisis. He began by outlining the problem here in the US.
Fundamentally, like, the housing crisis is an economic crisis, right? Like, it's basic economics to say that you have too much demand, not enough supply, and so prices have gone way up, right? When you drill down into that, though, there are a number of issues that you could look at. You could look at where housing is situated, the quality of that housing stock, right? Is it connected to schools, et cetera, jobs that people want to live in? I think that, like, when you look across America, we have in some ways enough housing, but it's in the wrong places and priced in the wrong ways.
What we're talking about really is cities, haven't we? A lot of more people are coming back into the cities after being in suburbia for decades. This is creating real problems for people who used to live in cities on middle-class incomes, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the historical data, right, like the migration out of cities, which happened at the same time as a lot of civil rights legislation, right, that desegregated cities, there was an aggressive push to create the suburbs, right? And now that people are sort of entranced by the city and are returning to it, there's a lot of pressure on housing markets that have largely stagnated. And so the kind of development that's happening now is situated towards higher income folks and is, as a result, pushing out lower income folks.
So what are the effects of that? Gentrification is happening here in DC. You see it everywhere in New York City, but also globally as well. You know, what happens to the teacher or the electrician who in times gone by could have lived near where they worked and sent their kids to local schools? What's happening to that person?
Well, those people are getting pushed out, right? They're getting pushed out, they're getting priced out. I would say that those impacts are also fall disproportionately on certain populations. So what we find is that more folks of color, more LGBTQ folks are more likely to be pushed out faster from a lot of these areas, specifically because of the way in which development is happening, right? So it's moving into these communities that have historically housed a lot of those folks and, you know, sort of redeveloping them into these very expensive condos, et cetera.
But the problem is that we need those people in the cities because we're all booming in services, and services tend to be at the lower wage end of the spectrum. So how do we get people into the cities and create affordable housing, or do they just get priced out?
I think that I mean, unfortunately, right, the answer to an economic question is money. So, like, if we subsidize housing in different ways, right? So there are a number of strategies around subsidizing housing in what's sort of workforce housing that's 80% AMI, area median income or below. Particularly, I think, for very poor folks, that's 30% AMI and below to zero, right? Those folks also need a lot of protections and subsidy. And you can approach that in two different ways, right? So you can either directly subsidize tenants through what's traditionally done through HUD dollars, right, in the form of vouchers, or you can create regulatory caps on market, right? So that's rent control.
So you're talking about rent controls, you're talking about basically the government helping with local authorities to subsidize people coming back. But, you know, property developers don't like it, right? They want to get luxury accommodation, they want to get top dollar. How do you do this in a free market like the US?
I mean, I think that at the end of the day, developers and landlords, right, they want people to pay. So, like, I have found that in the majority of those conversations, right, like, it's, you know, my landlord is generally pretty happy if I pay my rent every month on time. I think that if the payer is ultimately the government, a nonprofit, whoever, right? What ultimately matters is that payment is made. And so I think that if we think very flexibly about, like, the ways in which we can support the tenancy of folks who we want in our communities, right? We want these folks, as you said, here. That, I think, opens up a lot of different avenues to making that possible.
I think you're right. I want my kids' teachers to be in our own community. Everyone feels the same way. Are there any examples that you would pull from globally that could perhaps find the way for societies like the US?
I mean, I think that, you know, unfortunately, it sort of always goes to sort of the European conglomerate that's like sort of Norway and France, like folks who've done strong government side regulatory work around their housing markets, right? And have said, like, you know, there's simply a limit on what is reasonable to charge a tenant or a business, right, to be in a space. And I think that the abdication, frankly, of that policy agenda has damaged a lot of other nations and their ability to make sure that their citizens can thrive. I mean, there's a reason why, as we move into the 2020 presidential election, you are seeing candidate after candidate come out and talk about housing. That hasn't happened before, right? Like, this is actually the first time that we have seen multiple 2020 hopefuls, right, start talking about housing in their stump speeches. And I think that the reality is that Americans of sort of all stripes and colors are feeling the pressure of this housing crunch, right? And the growing out of reachness that no one can really afford a two-bedroom apartment anymore, that's bananas. So, like, to think about the need for some form of government intervention, again, either in terms of market cap or market subsidy, I think is just inevitable at this point.